In 1928, Edward Bernays published a book describing the principles of propaganda. During World War I, Bernays and others discovered that it was possible to not only rally public support for the war effort, but to also change people's attitudes towards the war. After the war ended, they found that propaganda could be just as useful in times of peace. Even though Bernays' book was written in the 1920s, it is still very relevant today. Bernays was one of the first people to master the art of public manipulation, and then to systematically apply it across every level of society, from big government to business, social services, and politics. Bernays brought together knowledge from experts in psychology and sociology such as Gustave Le Bon, Wilfred Trotter, Walter Lippmann, and his uncle Sigmund Freud. In his book titled Propaganda, he described the masses as irrational and subject to the herd instinct, and outlined how skilled practitioners could use crowd psychology and psychoanalysis to control them in desirable ways. Bernays was responsible for changing the public reputation of two U.S. presidents, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. He was also responsible for a popular smoking ad called "The Woman in Red," designed to promote femininity and smoking. Bernays is the father of modern propaganda. Before Bernays came along, propaganda was largely practiced along the lines of Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlovian conditioning comes from the famous experiments on dogs by the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov. The Pavlovian propaganda was crude. By repeating the same messages over and over, it was believed you could condition people into taking a certain action. The propaganda Bernays developed was much more subtle. By working on the unconscious in the ways people were unaware of, you could influence people's beliefs and actions without them ever knowing they were being influenced. With Bernays, propaganda became an art. Almost every piece of information we are exposed to today is propaganda. Its intention is to plant an idea or to facilitate an action. Propaganda is the mechanism by which ideas and attitudes are disseminated on a mass scale. Prior to World War I, propaganda was not considered a sinister means for spreading subversive falsehoods. It wasn't until World War II, when the Allies made the concept familiar to the people of Great Britain and the United States, that propaganda came to be seen as a means of spreading opinions and principles. Although the practice had, albeit unnamed, been variously used by governments for centuries, it was not until 1915 that the government first systematically deployed the entire range of modern media to rouse their populations to fanatical assent. Here was an extraordinary state accomplishment: mass enthusiasm at the prospect of a global brawl that would otherwise mystify those very masses, and that shattered most of those who had taken part in it. Every society uses its propaganda during wartime to mobilize hatred against the enemy, to convince the population of the justness of the cause, as well as gaining the support and cooperation of neutral countries. After pinning the war guilt on the enemy, the next step is to make them appear savage, barbaric, and inhumane. All the participating countries in World War I used propaganda associated with the enemy that made use of stereotypes that developed prior to the war. The use of stereotypes associated with the enemy is necessary for creating anti-symbols in the way the enemy is portrayed in propaganda. An enemy is needed because it provides a target that can be attacked, as well as a scapegoat to pin the blame on. Behind the scenes are the manipulators of patriotic opinion who make use of the mental cliches and emotional habits of the public to produce mass reactions against the alleged atrocities, the terror and tyranny of the enemy. People often live with attitudes that were made by someone they have never even heard of. These propagandists are the ones that move the levers of society. Edward Bernays calls these propagandists an invisible government in his book Propaganda. The propagandists today constitute an invisible government, a supreme leader mastering the responses of a pliable, receptive population. Conscious and intelligent manipulation. Behind him are invisible governors, those who pull the wires that control the public mind, shrewd persons that operate behind the scenes, dictators exercising great power, and below them, people working as if actuated by the touch of a button. Edward Bernays makes the case in his book that this way of spreading information is useful and even necessary for any public undertaking where approval of the masses is needed. Whether it's an effort to improve public health through vaccinations or educating young people about the dangers of unprotected sex, every social service agenda has a need for propaganda, just as any political agenda if it is going to be successful. According to Bernays, propaganda is a necessary and also natural part of any society, because the majority cannot rule. For anything to get done, there has to be group organizers and leaders. This naturally means that some will have more authority than others. There is no system of governance conceivable where society can be ruled by the majority. This is why there is a need for propaganda. Every form of government, whether democratic, communist, or monarchical, depends upon public opinion for the success of their efforts. In our present social organization, approval of the public is essential to any undertaking. This then evidently indicates the fact that anyone with sufficient influence can lead sections of the public at least for a time and for a purpose. Formerly, the rulers were the leaders. They used their position of authority to command the masses into obedience. They laid out the course of history by doing what they wanted. The successors of the rulers, those whose position gives them power, can no longer do what they want without the approval of the masses. They find in propaganda a tool which allows them to obtain that approval. If any propaganda is to be effective, then it must limit itself to a few simplistic claims. The simplest and most direct dogmatic assertions are the most effective at gaining the attention and support of the masses. Then these affirmations are repeated everywhere, so they are heard and understood by all. Hitler, who was a master of propaganda, said, "All propaganda has to be popular, and has to accommodate itself to the comprehension of the least intelligent of those to whom it seeks to reach." The world of politics was the first department to use propaganda on a mass scale. Today, politics places emphasis on personality. Often an entire platform or international policy is sold to the public, or is not sold, on the basis of personality alone. This is one of the most effective means of propaganda used today. The politicians dramatize themselves and their platform in the terms that have meaning for the public. In a democracy as well as any other society, the group follows those they recognize as its leaders. This means that if one wishes to gain leadership in society, they must first learn its prejudices as well as its idealism. The 20th century has many examples of personality cults. The Cuban dictator Fidel Castro's road to fame was actually very similar to infamous figures such as Mao, Hitler, Gaddafi, Mussolini, and even Stalin. They were charismatic up-and-comers, and after they seized power, they unleashed a torrent of propaganda and repression that created a cult of personality. The important thing for any statesman in our age is not so much to know how to please the public, but how to sway the public. It can be done only by meeting conditions of the public mind, by creating circumstances which set up trains of thought, by dramatizing personalities, by establishing contact with the group leaders who control the opinions of the groups. Propaganda tends to make the President of the United States so important that he becomes not the president, but the embodiment of hero worship. This is a condition that reflects the desires of a part of the public. Personality cults have always formed around U.S. presidents. Certain presidents of the United States have been praised in ways that would not be out of place in a totalitarian state. Obama's finest speeches do not excite, they do not inform, they elevate. They enmesh you in a grander moment, as if history has stopped flowing passively by, and just for an instant contracted around you, made you aware of its presence and your role in it. He is not word made flesh, but the triumph of word over flesh, over color, over despair. The other great leaders guide us towards better politics, but Obama is, at his best, able to call us back to our highest selves, to the place where America exists as a glittering ideal, and where we, its honored inhabitants, seem capable of achieving it, and thus of sharing in its meaning and transcendence. In the past, humanity worshipped gods and spiritual beings, not to mention ancestor worship. But today we worship personalities instead of supernatural beings. Celebrities and political figures have been elevated to the point of deity worship by the use of propaganda. The means of controlling the opinions of the masses begins by gaining the support of the leaders of those groups which the propaganda seeks to influence. This revelation has unearthed the possibility for an invisible government that can manipulate individuals through the groups they belong to. The leaders then act as the propagandists by lending their name and support to a policy or an idea. One of the purposes of propaganda is to seek to make credibility determine what is true or false. In an interview on The Letterman Show in 1985, Bernays said authority makes one more believable. People naturally look for an authority figure they can look to for guidance. If they hear a person they admire or respect supporting some cause, then they are more likely to view it favorably. So if you influence the leader whether they know it or not, then you automatically persuade the group they lead. Men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be subject to the influences of mass psychology. Because man is by nature gregarious, he feels himself to be a member of a herd, even when he is alone in his room with the curtain drawn. His mind retains the patterns which have been stamped on it by the group influences. Everyone imagines that they are making decisions based on their own judgments, when in fact these judgments are a mixed bag of impressions stamped on the mind by outside influences that unconsciously control their thought. In his book, Bernays explains, "The group mind does not think in the strict sense of the word. In place of thoughts, it has impulses, habits, and emotions. In making up its mind, its first impulse is usually to follow the example of a trusted leader. This is one of the most firmly established principles in mass psychology. When there is no example from group leaders, then people must decide for themselves. They do so by attitudes and sentiments that are familiar to their respective groups. If an idea is associated with emotionally charged words such as racism or socialist, then many people will vote for the opposite with an almost religious zeal. By playing upon an old cliché or creating a new one, a propagandist can sway the emotions of an entire nation." Bernays, being aware of the dangers posed by propaganda, explains that it has the same relation to education as business and social services. Some may use it to advertise an institution or to create artificial values in a segment of the population. There is no guarantee against its misuse. On the other hand, some of the best efforts to improve society have used propaganda to increase the success of their efforts. By using the principles of mass psychology and winning over the leaders of segments of the population, propaganda is the vehicle used for any social change. Bernays believed it should be used responsibly to inform the public of real issues. Only through the active energy of the intelligent few can the public at large become aware of and act upon new ideas. A social service organization undertook to fight lynching, Jim Crowism, and the civil discrimination against Black Americans. The campaigns for the preservation of the teeth sought to alter people's habits in the direction of more frequent brushing of teeth. The campaign to lower infant mortality rates was an effort to alter the habits of mothers in regards to breastfeeding, bathing, and caring for their babies. Social service, then, is identical with propaganda. The social settlement, the organized campaigns against tuberculosis and cancer, the various activities aiming directly at the elimination of social diseases and maladjustments, a multitude of altruistic activities which could be catalogued only in a book of many pages, have need of knowledge of the public mind and mass psychology if they are to achieve their aims. Any social change requires an organized effort of creating public awareness around the issue and then buying the support of group leaders who influence the masses. Without propaganda, civilization would come to a standstill. The great enemy of any attempt to change men's habits is inertia. Civilization is limited by inertia. In our society, the most valuable commodity is attention. According to some studies, we are exposed to between 4,000 to 10,000 ads in one day. Ads are so commonplace in our lives we hardly even pay attention anymore. Since propaganda is literally everywhere in our society today, the only thing the individual can do is to learn its mechanics and try to guard against it. Its influence has shaped more parts of our lives than we even realize. Many people believe that their interests and habits are their own, but in reality most of them have been shaped by propaganda. In our society today, there is a throne behind the world of politics, fashion, music, and education that essentially governs these areas of social life. These are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions.